Dzień dobry Państwu, witam serdecznie. Chciałem przedstawić na początek naszych panelistów. Pan profesor Freeman, którego już Państwo dobrze znacie z Uniwersytetu Essex, a po mojej prawej stronie trzy bardzo zasłużone dla rozwoju festiwalu filmów o prawach człowieka osoby. Andrea Kuhn z festiwalu w Nuremberdze. Czy jest Hanna Kulhankova, dyrektorka festiwalu One World w Pradze z organizacji People in Need. Jako Ruighaver, organizator i dyrektor festiwalu Movies Matter w Hadze, niegdyś w Amsterdamie, Amnesty International i właśnie Fundacja Movies Matter. Chcemy w tej sesji zastanowić się nad edukacją i promocją praw człowieka. Wydaje nam się, że w tej dziedzinie w ostatniej dekadzie wiele się zmieniło i że użycie filmu dokumentalnego w celu edukacji i promocji praw człowieka jest jednym z takich stosunkowo jednak na tę skalę nowych zjawisk, o jakich właśnie w ciągu ostatniej dekady możemy mówić. Bardzo się cieszę, że mamy tutaj właśnie w panelu teoretyka pana profesora Freemana, który w ogóle reprezentuje podejście interdyscyplinarne do praw człowieka i oddaję głos panu profesorowi. Bardzo proszę o prezentację.
My academic disciplines are political theory and social science. So I would like to suggest how social science might contribute to human rights education in a way that I hope is parallel to the contribution of documentary film, which is not at all my expertise. Social science I shall discuss is anthropology, and I shall end with a story, so that's the closest I can get to being a documentarist. It's often said, as we discussed in the opening session of this conference, that cultural diversity is an obstacle to the implementation of human rights worldwide. Anthropologists specialize in the study of local cultures and should therefore be able to throw some light on the cultural gap between international human rights and local ways of life. Anthropologists have a disciplinary commitment to context, which is in tension with the universalist logic of human rights. The anthropologist Kirsten Hastrup has said that the United Nations declares human rights while people live their cultures. The anthropology of human rights does not exclude universal human rights standards. It does call for an understanding of cultural difference. When the international concept of human rights is introduced into local contexts, it mixes and sometimes competes with other moral ideas. Local leaders of social struggles may appropriate human rights discourses as part of their strategies. In doing so, they may combine human rights with community standards. The cultural gap between the global and the local requires translation of the universal discourse of human rights into local languages. Translation requires translators. These may be human rights activists, lawyers, religious leaders, and so on. In the process of translation, human rights can be rejected. They can become mere decoration for local practices. They can form cultural hybrids, or they can subvert local traditions in favor of a modern rights culture. By analyzing local cultures, anthropologists can show that they are not what they seem to be and do not have the value that is attributed to them. And I'd like to give an example, which is a true story, which I get from an excellent book by the anthropologist Sally Engel-Merry. The title of the book is Human Rights and Gender Violence. So I'm now going to tell you a story. It's quite a complicated story, but the fact that it is complicated is really the point. The mixture of local culture and human rights law is complicated. This is the story. It's about Hong Kong. When Britain leased the new territories of Hong Kong from China in 1899, it promised to respect Chinese customary law. Part of this customary law was the rule that only men could inherit property. When the father of an indigenous woman of the new territories, Lai Shung-cheng, died, her two brothers inherited the family house in which she was living. In May 1991, they decided to sell the house to a private developer. Miss Cheng refused to leave unless she was given a share of the proceeds, citing a Qing dynasty custom that allowed unmarried women to reside indefinitely in the family home after the father's death. For the next 2 years, Miss Cheng was severely harassed by the buyer of the house to force her to leave. Fed up with this harassment, Miss Cheng wrote a letter to the Chinese newspaper, Oriental Daily, explaining her situation. Someone at the paper put Miss Cheng in touch with Linda Wong, a social worker at the Hong Kong Federation of Women's Centres. Miss Cheng told Miss Wong that she knew several other indigenous women in similar situations. Miss Wong asked Miss Cheng to contact these women and bring them to a meeting. Several indigenous women met Miss Wong, the social worker, in 1992. After this meeting, the women met informally various government officials and members of the Hong Kong Legislative Council. When Hong Kong submitted its report to the UN Human Rights Committee in 1991, the Hong Kong Council of Women prepared a shadow report in which they claimed that the inheritance law was a form of gender discrimination that contravened both Hong Kong and international human rights law. The 4 authors of the Council of Women's shadow report were Western women with strong academic backgrounds. In preparing, this is where you have to listen carefully, it gets complicated. In preparing the shadow report, one of its authors discovered that the inheritance law applied not only to indigenous women of the new territories, but to all its inhabitants. Thus, non-indigenous women in the new territories would be unable to inherit property, while women in urban Hong Kong could do so. In November 1993, the Hong Kong government introduced the New Territories Land Exemption Ordinance that exempted urban land in the new territories from the inheritance law. A legislator, Christine Lowe, proposed an amendment extending the bill to all women. This move led to the creation of the Anti-Discrimination Female Indigenous Residents Committee. This organisation included indigenous women, Miss Wong, the social worker, a representative from the Association for the Advancement of Feminism, a reporter from Radio Television Hong Kong, an anthropology graduate student, and a trade union organiser. At first, the indigenous women advanced their claims in terms of family obligations, emphasising that they had been dutiful daughters and tried to persuade their relatives to fulfil their family obligations. When that didn't work, they learned to translate their family grievances into the language of rights and equality with the help of the Anti-Discrimination Committee. This was necessary to secure a hearing from the Legislative Council and the media, who were not interested in family quarrels, but were interested in gender equality and human rights. In June 1944, the Legislative Council passed the amended bill by 36 votes to 2, so the campaign was successful. 4 features of this campaign are particularly worth noting. Firstly, indigenous women were able to translate grievances that they originally conceptualized in terms of traditional culture into the language of human rights. Secondly, modern, quotes, Hong Kong professionals helped them to make this translation. Thirdly, while the indigenous women were prepared to use the human rights discourse to advance their cause, they were reluctant to abandon the traditional family values framework. Fourthly, the coincidence of the inheritance campaign with Hong Kong's submission of a report under the terms of an international human rights treaty shows that international human rights law can play a part in a successful local human rights campaign. Human rights anthropology has shown ways in which the international regime may change local cultures. Not only do international and national elites seek to change practices at the local level, but the leaders of local popular struggles appeal to international human rights standards to fight local and national elites. Support for human rights standards is sometimes stronger at the local than at the governmental level. Thus, culture can be a resource for the implementation of human rights and not simply an obstacle to be overcome. Anthropology offers a fine-grained analysis of how human rights campaigns interact with cultural commitments at the local level. The Hong Kong case study shows that traditional culture can interact with local and international human rights laws and with political struggles to implement human rights standards in ways that combine international norms and local cultures in complex manners. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo Pani Profesor za to interesujące case study i wnioski, które z niego płyną. Rzeczywiście, kiedy słuchałem prezentacji, miałem takie wrażenie, że to przypomina trochę dokumenty, które również są pewnymi konkretnymi historiami, często pokazującymi różne sposoby transmisji właśnie międzynarodowego prawa, praw człowieka do konkretnych, bardzo lokalnych, kulturowo również odległych od Zachodu sytuacji czy historii. Mam takie pytanie do Pana Profesora, ponieważ Pana praca w zasadzie nadal wydaje się dosyć unikalna, czyli nie jest tak wielu specjalistów, teoretyków, którzy podchodzą do praw człowieka tak szeroko i tak interdyscyplinarnie. Czy ma Pan Profesor czasem takie wrażenie, że każdy specjaliści różnych specjalności, jak również różne grupy, na przykład politycy, ruchy społeczne, mówią o prawach człowieka co innego, mówią jakby trochę o czym innym i że niewystarczająco mocno się słuchają. Ja podam taki jeden przykład konkretny. W podręczniku profesora Brandta do etyki, który jest używany na wielu uczelniach, w szczególności amerykańskich, jest rozdział o prawach człowieka, w którym mowa jest o tym, że właściwie to koncept praw człowieka osłabia fakt, że nie istnieją prawa absolutne, nieograniczone. I jakby niezależnie od tego, jakie konwencje międzynarodowe podpisały Stany Zjednoczone, czy nie, w systemie ONZ-owskim jednak takie prawa absolutne istnieją, jak chociażby zakaz niewolnictwa, czy wolność od tortur. Wydaje mi się, że to jest taki przykład właśnie, kiedy jeden dyskurs, w tym wypadku filozoficzny, etyczny, jakby jest bardzo odległy od na przykład dyskursu prawnego. Że takich przypadków jest sporo, a że tak naprawdę to pokazuje właśnie jakby taką sytuację, w której mamy do czynienia z różnymi dyskursami praw człowieka. Bardzo bym prosił o komentarz, czy zgadza się Pan z taką intuicją, czy też nie ma takiej sytuacji?
My simple answer to your question is yes. It's particularly true that if you really want, first of all, a disagreement, and secondly, a disagreement where the parties are not really understanding each other, put a human rights lawyer and a philosopher together in the same room. Philosophers actually make their living by disagreeing with each other. Maybe lawyers do too. And of course, something I tell my students about the difficulty of interpreting human rights just within the discipline of law is that human rights courts often make their decisions that are not unanimously. So human rights lawyers often disagree at least about the finer points of human rights law. Once you bring philosophers in, from I say also anthropologists into the room, you will get a lot of disagreement. One of the tasks, and one thing I tried to do, not always successfully, is work out what it is we really agree about, because I think that's important, and to identify core areas of agreement and what might be more refined areas where there's room for reasonable disagreement. And I'm sure there are areas where there's room for reasonable disagreement.
Dziękuję bardzo. Chciałem teraz przejść do takiej krótkiej prezentacji tak naprawdę festiwali filmów o prawach człowieka i czegoś, co być może można nazwać ruchem takich festiwali. Tako Ruighaver jest jednym z autorów pomysłu i realizatorów tego pomysłu, mianowicie Platformy Współpracy Festiwali Filmów o prawach człowieka. Tanko, proszę, powiedz nam trochę o samej idei Festiwali Filmów o prawach człowieka i o naszej platformie, Human Rights Film Network.
Thank you and good afternoon. As Maciej stated, I was asked to tell you about the fast-growing family of human rights film festivals and the Human Rights Film Network, and I guess that is because this afternoon these kinds of festivals and this network will be referred to quite a lot. Basically, human rights film festivals are, of course, the international equivalents of the Watchdog Festival here in Warsaw. They recognize films as powerful tools for advocacy. Through a combination of film screenings, debates and discussions with filmmakers and activists, and often arts and music exhibitions, festivals create a space for the investigation of human rights issues that encourages networking on all levels. One can see this from the beginning. First held in 1985, the Vermont International Film Festival is billed as the world's oldest environmental and human rights film festival. The festival sprung from the local peace movement. And human rights film festivals have multiplied in the decades since. Only 3 years after, in honor of the 40th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 10th anniversary of the organization itself, the Human Rights Watch Film Festival started in New York, and soon after, I guess your festival started when? In 1999, and in the Netherlands, the Amnesty International Film Festival started in 1995. The start of the first festival in Buenos Aires, and so basically in the end of the 1990s we had about 10, 14 film festivals like that. And by then a few colleagues of mine and I at the Locarno Film Festival decided to come together and to try to find ways in order to share experiences and to maybe can work more efficient, to share maybe educational materials and so on, because we were all doing the same job without really knowing each other and without really sharing the work we do. So it was in 2004 that at Hanna's Festival in Prague we launched the Human Rights Film Network, and by now the network has 33 members and all over the world. It's from Seoul to Kabul, from Johannesburg to Becca, and so those festivals, they all have their own history, their own background. A lot of them are spring from human rights organizations, mine from Amnesty International, yours from the Helsińska Foundation, yours from the People in Need Foundation, Human Rights Watch is also logical. The one in Vilnius is also an initiative of the main Lithuanian human rights human rights organization. So we had a lot of them had this background. Some of them are founded by artists or activist filmmakers who wanted to react on things that were going on in their society. For example, a colleague from Argentina, he was in exile for a long time, and when he moved back to Argentina, he wanted by film to reflect on things happened in his country. And quite a lot of festivals, they start in reaction to what is happening in their own society. In Naples, for example, they started in reaction to the crisis of the waste. It's still in the streets over there. And another example is that in Glasgow they started because the refugees and the immigrants were so under fire, and so that was for them a particular reason. In our case, we started our festival in 1995 in the perspective of the Beijing conference on women. Well, so now we're a network, and once you're an identity, you need some criteria. For belonging to the Human Rights Film Network, as it is written down in our charter, it starts with understanding the concept of human rights. The network strives to promote the broad concept of human rights on the basis of international standards and as embedded in the Universal Declaration and other international laws. The festivals recognize and abide by the definition of human rights, which includes the protection of human dignity and the opportunity for all to live safe and well. And even with this charter in place, however, human rights are not a fixed and defined concept, but, like Professor Freeman just stressed, constantly negotiated at local and global level. Human rights film festivals provide places in which these debates, discussion and definitions are clarified, and where cultural specificity develops on notions of human rights. The concept of a human rights film may be fairly recent concept, but I believe such films have been made during the entire century of moving pictures history. Famous directors, as well as local filmmakers, have documented human rights abuses and have striven to give a voice to those who were not heard by the powers that be. You have to tell me, do you want a short story or you want the extended version?
Medium one.
Medium one. Okay. I thought I would tell you about the criteria we use for a human rights film, but in short, so that now in medium, it's that it can be any format, it can be any genre. Of course, one way or another, it is relating to human rights, and the film may be harshly realistic or highly utopian. They may offer gruesome pictures or show the bliss of peaceful life. They may be a higher accurate report of facts or offer a surreal provocation. And it goes without saying that human rights film festivals strive to promote films that have a good cinematographic quality in terms of photography, narrative, written, and other technical characteristics. And the whole charter for those interested are on the website to be found of the Human Rights Film Network, humanrightsfilmnetwork.org. It's very easy. What differs us from regular festivals is, I think, and the main difference is that our festivals are more than the film screenings themselves. Whether the concept is a festival, a one-day festival, or 10 days festival, what we do is we organize additional debates, discussions, Q&A sessions, workshops, master classes, lectures, conferences like these around the films. Human rights film festivals, and in the debates, the filmmakers, human rights defenders, experts, representatives of NGOs, influentials, and the audience can analyze situations and try to find solutions. We, as the Movies That Matter Festival, started posting up ourselves as a film and debate festival, thus stressing its essential and distinctive dialogue part as and function. And Maciej confessed me that he stole this. Yeah, but it's a gift, you can keep it. Medium, right?
Medium, right.
Okay, there's one thing I would like to stress, because over here in Warsaw and in a lot of Western countries, it's pretty easy to organize these festivals. We do have colleagues in other countries that do have a really hard time. Often in not that open societies, of course, and examples of our colleagues who are really in trouble are, for example, our colleagues in Seoul, who can't have indoor screenings, they have to have outdoor screenings. The Bahrain Festival, which wanted to have a second edition, but it's still delayed, and the Cameroon Festival is still waiting for better times so they can have a festival like that. Okay, I'm sorry to end up with those worrying facts, but the good news is that there is a lively human rights film world, and that's good news.
Dziękuję bardzo za tę prezentację. Z reguły festiwale o prawach człowieka stanowią taką platformę organizacyjną, programową przede wszystkim, ale także promocyjną i fundraisingową dla różnych działań społecznych przy użyciu filmu dokumentalnego. Festiwal One World jest szczególnie bogaty w takie właśnie wydarzenia czy działania poza samym festiwalem i może posłużyć za świetny przykład. Dlatego poproszę Cię, Hanna, o właśnie przedstawienie Twoich takich outreach activities.
I'll try to be brief as well. Is it possible to put the PowerPoint presentation? If not, then it's fine. So, before I start talking about the festival itself, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background of organization People in Need, because it is very much connected to what we do as the festival and also what are our aims with our activities. So People in Need is an NGO based in the Czech Republic. It has projects in the Czech Republic, but also all around the world in different, like 40 countries around the world. The biggest scope of activities is dealing with providing relief and development assistance, for example in Haiti or Afghanistan, where we have the biggest office. Then another part of activities is dealing with helping human rights defenders in societies where there is no freedom and democracy. So, for example, we work in Belarus, we also work in Cuba, we work in Burma. So those are the kind of countries where we try to help human rights defenders. Then in the Czech Republic itself, the biggest scope of activities are dealing with socially excluded people. We already had a discussion, a panel discussion about this before this one. And another part of activities that are dealing with the Czech Republic are information and educational activities. And One World, as a human rights film festival itself, kind of really tackles all the issues that the organization is doing, and is also trying very deeply to be connected with all the departments of People in Need and be part of the campaigns, but also is trying to help through the films to get a message. Okay, great. Yeah. but I can keep on talking and then.
It's ready, but not working.
Yeah, I think it will take some time. So I'm gonna tell you some like basic facts about the festival, because I think One World is really an example of like an advocacy film festival that is also becoming a very like popular and in a way maybe mainstream festival, because the number of people that visit One World every year is 100,000 people, so it's really a big number of people that are exposed to human rights related films and content. We every year usually screen, okay, so can you put next slide? Next, yeah. We usually screen over 100 documentary films, which are selected from around 1,600 films. So you can really see that every year there is a really huge production of documentary films being made all around the world. And also, as Taco was talking before me, I really don't like kind of this concept of human rights documentary film, because I think that really in my festival we can show any kind of documentary film and we can put it into the context of human rights. So I don't really like the distinction between a documentary film and a human rights documentary film, because I think the distinction is how you use the film. Like if there is some kind of like activity following up, if there is a campaign that is attached to the film, so you can, at One World you can see a film that wins a Cannes festival, maybe, maybe not, but it can be in my festival seen as a human rights films, which is really nice, and it's also like opening eyes of like film directors that sometimes they are really like asking, but my film is not dealing with human rights, so why do you want to include it in your festival? So we kind of have to really explain our idea how we select the films. Every year we got around 200 international guests that come to the festival, and the next edition is going to be in March 2012. And I try to put some like brief topics, what kind of films you can see at One World, and not only in my festival but also at other human rights film festivals. And it's really like never-ending list. We have films that deal with like crisis areas and current affairs. We have films that deal with legacy of the past. Especially, for example, in Czech Republic, it's very relevant, the past of the 20th century, the communist era, post-communist era, because those are the topics that are usually not taught at elementary or high schools. Or we are dealing with, for example, LGBT issues, gender issues. We are also including environmental films into the program, so you can really see that there are many, many topics that relate to human rights. So next slide, please. So, this slide I tried to kind of, I'm not sure if everybody sees it, but I was trying to kind of present graphically. It was the first time that I made this graphic thing in PowerPoint, so okay, so it's a sun. And I was trying to really see, like show you the scope of activities that come from the One World Film Festival. And the scope of activities could be maybe divided into who we aim the activities to. So one aim is really involving local civic society organizations or individuals. So apart from the big festival in Prague, we are also supporting the regional festivals the same way as Watch Dogs is doing, that there are like 40 regional One World Film Festivals around the Czech Republic, and all these festivals are organized by local organizations, so that's very important for engaging the regular public in their locations where they live with issues that are dealt in films. Then another big group of people that can really use the films are students and teachers. I was told that many of you are university and PhD students. So at One World we have a big, now it's already like a separate department that is called One World in Schools, and it deals with bringing films to elementary and high schools, training teachers, establishing film clubs at high schools, but also bringing kids to the festival. So in a way it's really kind of building up the future audience. And we also have a program that is directed to PhD students and university students, where we put together a collection of films under a title History, Film and Human Rights. And we bought these films, made like a special packages, and now anybody who teaches at university can get the films for free and use them for their seminars or lectures. And the topics are different topics, for example, slavery, gender issues, different like conflicts happening around the world. I mean, I have one leaflet here only in Czech. So, and this is a very like good tool because university teachers and students, they are not really used to, for example, if they're studying law or teaching law, they are not used to using films to kind of support the debate or open up debate, but the documentary films are really good tool for using that. Another big like focus group that can really find films useful and are policymakers. So we, together with other human rights film festivals, we are organizing a big One World in Brussels, and also Tacos Festival is happening in Hague. So those are really good places where you can bring human rights defenders that relate to the films, and on the other hand you can bring the politicians, and they clash, and maybe something will really happen, and politicians will really start being interested in what's really going on around the world, and maybe the laws will be changed. And like every year we really feel that it's very important to be present in such cities which kind of are examples of the policy being made every day. I'm not sure if the policy is made for the citizens, but maybe it will change in the future. And another big group that we are focusing on nowadays with our festival are film professionals. It's going to be like a new activity that One World will start doing, is that we will create a so-called like industry section for film professionals, where we will invite hundreds of distributors, commissioning editors, directors, and we will have like special workshops and master classes and activities. And we hope that it will, in a way, not only bring the filmmakers for to the festival, but putting these activities in the context of the Human Rights Film Festival, that it will also bring back kind of that the filmmakers will be exposed to the topics that maybe usually they don't have to deal with. So in the future we will see more maybe films that are like more interested to human rights film festivals. And I would like in more detail talk about one activity that we started 2 years ago. So next slide, please. I have to. Yeah. So in 2010 we had a One World campaign that was related to a new activity that we started at the festival. We started, we call it like a grassroots distribution of films. So this is just an example of a poster that we had. It's like it really looks like a very commercial poster. We were very criticized from like our traditional audience for having like a model on the poster, having a lasso in her hand. But we really wanted to really kind of engage our audience into really thinking like, what does it mean? I mean, woman with a lasso related to human rights. So, but for us it was really a symbol of that anybody can really become a person who is screening the film to his or her audience. So the lasso was kind of a symbol of you have to catch your audience somehow, and you have to be creative in a way. So next slide. So this distribution activity is called to get your audience. In Czech it's promítej i ty. It would translate into like you can also screen films, and it's really an alternative film distribution activity because Czech Republic is a very small market and you don't really get many documentary films being distributed in the regular cinemas, but there is always after every one world there is a big demand from people on like how they always come to us and ask, so we missed the film or we love the film, where can we get it? So, but we said like nowhere. I mean, you either have to wait if once the video is for sale, or there's like no way that you can really see it again in the Czech Republic context. So we decided that we will try one thing, that we will let the audience vote on the best 3 to 5 films from the program, and then that we will try to buy the film rights, and we will make DVDs, and then we will distribute it to whoever won the DVD. So in 2010 we really tried, but we had no idea whether it would work, whether the distributors would really understand what we want, whether we will have like enough finances for it. But to our surprise, it really worked. The hardest thing for us was not the price. I mean, the films were not for free, just for maybe, I mean, usual price that we had to pay was for one film between like 500 to 1,000 euros for having the rights for the film for 3 to 5 years. And the biggest challenge was really kind of explaining the distributor the purpose of like using the film, because the distributors were kind of thinking into these kind of like boxes that either you use film for a festival or you use a film for theatrical distribution, and that's it. But we were saying, okay, we are going to use it for distribution, but for like grassroots distribution, that an individual can get a film and organize a screening in the living room. And it's important because in the living room the person invites his or her family and they have a discussion, and then they send us the photos how they're sitting in the living room and discussing a film on like journalists killed in Russia, and it's really powerful because, you know, except, I mean, the family is not watching football in the evening, but they are really watching a human rights documentary film on Russia. And that was really our purpose, to bring films into context where the documentary films are usually not being seen. And we are really happy with the whole activity, because till now we already have like 900 very active, engaged, we call them projectionists, who are, there is a mistake, it should be 13 documentary films are now in the collection, not 3. And because we are really asking these projectionists, like after every screening, to give us a feedback, how the film was, how the discussion was, if they have like any positive or negative reactions. And during these 2 years, we already had like 35,000 people who have seen the human rights documentary films in places as like pubs, you know, where people usually watch football, but sometimes they watch film Hunger, which is a film that deals with poverty. Or there were many times screen films in churches, which is also like interesting because Czech Republic is, you know, we really don't go to church a lot, but churches really become kind of, in some places, like a cultural kind of alternative centers. Or people were using these films in hospitals, that they would borrow the films and watch them in hospitals. So it's really very interesting, and we still want to continue with this next year as well. So I recommend this kind of activity to like other film festivals to use it, but of course Czech Republic is a very small market, as we were telling with Andrea. It would be different for Germany because it's much bigger and maybe more difficult. Yeah, so this was one of the examples how you can use documentary films. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo, Hanna. Po takim wprowadzeniu w tematykę tego, co bywa robione, czy jest robione z filmem dokumentalnym dla praw człowieka, chyba najtrudniejsza część dyskusji przed nami, to znaczy próba oceny i próba takiego zmapowania problemów, ale także ewentualnych kierunków rozwoju. Co można zrobić więcej i również co jest najbardziej skuteczne w kształtowaniu świadomości i na temat praw człowieka i postaw, które sprzyjają poszanowaniu. Andrea, Kuhn, proszę Cię bardzo, Andrea, o właśnie taką próbę spojrzenia, próbę oceny i jakieś myśli o przyszłości.
So I hope I'm prepared for myself. Actually, before I start to talk, I have to tell you like 2 words about us, because our festival is maybe a bit different from Movies That Matter, Watchdogs, as well as One World. And some of what I will be talking about comes from this different background. So our festival, the Nurember International Human Rights Film Festival, is one of the few festivals that's not organized by an NGO or people with a human rights background, but as VIII in Hungary, we're one of the festivals with a cinema and film background. So this will, of course, color whatever I have to say about human rights films. And as Movies That Matter does, for example, we do not restrict ourselves to documentaries, that word, restrict ourselves to documentaries, but we also include fiction film, experimental film, animation, whatever you can find. Yeah, so like I said, Movies That Matter as well. So, yeah. What I prepared is to talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses maybe of using documentary film in human rights education. Because I think most of you are not from a film background, so it might be interesting to discuss just the basic concept of what do we do with these films and what do we want to do with these films. So I will try to reflect on that a little bit. Well, I guess one of the biggest strengths of film is, and docs or fiction film, it doesn't matter, is the low threshold that you have in finding audiences and attracting people to deal with human rights. I don't have to explain to you that it's one of the most popular entertainments in many countries to go to the cinema, so there is a general openness of people to go and watch a film, and it might be a much greater openness than to come to a panel like this, for example, or just listen to somebody giving a lecture on specific human rights issues. But film also has the unique power to bring us actually literally close to issues and close to people. And I'm not just talking about close-ups in cinema. If you reflect back on when you're in a cinema, people are really close, and I mean literally close to you, closer than they will ever get if you go to a lecture or anything else. In this way, films can really grab you, and they can change the relationship that you have to people in the film. Film gives spaces to statistics. It gives spaces to lectures, to actual issues, and it does so through complex forms of identification. Watching a film is not only about learning something, it's about experiencing something, and I think that's the biggest advantage of cinema. It's also very specific to film. Film is always much more than just language. It's its greatest strength. In fact, this is the very quality that turns film material into film. So there's a difference. Everything that's filmed is not automatically a film. A film is this extra quality of narration, extra quality of language beyond language. Human rights film festivals, I think, are a perfect platform for human rights education, because they will for one thing, present the films, but they also create spaces where we can invite filmmakers, experts on issues, so we can offer a complete package that intensifies and deepens the experience of the films itself. They create a motivation to engage. At the same time, film is not reality. Documentaries are not reality. They are not evidence. Although they might contain material that can serve as evidence. And actually there are quite a couple of examples in recent years where material from documentary films has been used as evidence in legal cases. One of them you might have heard of is Enemies of the People, about Cambodia. Material from this film is being used right now in the trials against number 2 of the Khmer Rouge. Also a film like Granito that's been to festivals worldwide, in which old film material has been used in a court case. Now, coming to the maybe weaknesses that I wouldn't call weaknesses, but just points of caution if you want to use film as an advocacy tool. Well, documentaries are not reality, they are not evidence, and they shouldn't be treated as if they were. This can develop into a conflict of interest, of course. The best films for advocacy, or some might call human rights education, might look for a very concise presentation of facts. They will make sure that the message comes across as clearly as possible. But you could also have films that choose a very filmic and cinematic language and trust their audiences to understand, despite the lack of statistics, despite the lack of off-commentary, by simply, or I should say simply, observing what they're being presented, by taking part in somebody's life, for example. And they will have to rely on the ability of their audiences to understand and then make an informed decision without telling people what this decision should look like. So there are two basic questions. One is, what do we want from films in human rights education? And the second is, which films do we deem suitable for that? And to choose these films and to fruitfully engage in a discussion of these films, we need to discuss, as I would propose, both content and form. That's too often forgotten because people focus exclusively on issues, but as you know, films are never just innocent. They are not reality, they are not evidence. And all too often the competence on the filming part is not available. It's always not easily available. To come back to this point, films are based on many choices. No film just is, you know. It does not present reality as it is. Every film will shorten whatever the filmic material. They will present it in a certain way. And this way will influence the interpretation any audience has for the film. And let's not forget that even with documentaries, there are a billion of possibilities of how to shoot a documentary. You can do an observational documentary, you may have a satiric, provocative, surreal documentary. There are very different forms, and all of them are valuable, and none of them is better than the other. There is no golden way of filmmaking. Now this creates a couple of basic ethic questions in the film selection. One question would be, how conscious is the filmmaker of his or her choices? Do they acknowledge, do they understand that they are making choices? Is his or her style visible in the film? And does it problematize the process of filmmaking? You know, we have plenty of filmmakers who go, let's say, the basic example, go to Africa and shoot films maybe in their former colonies of their home countries. Now what does that mean? Is that just reality, or is this a very complex relationship between the filmmaker and what's being filmed? And reflecting on that, I think, is a valuable and very political act. Not reflecting on it, which usually results in easily consumable documentaries where you just present it as an objective point of view, becomes a less political film, I would say, and less ethical film as well. And there are a couple of films that really problematize this relationship, or also problematize the use of historic material. When we think back of films about dictatorships and totalitarian systems, usually the material that is available is regime material. It has been shot with a specific propagandic purpose. Now if you just use that in a documentary about those times, you're replicating, or you might be replicating, the same structure of totalitarianism. So we're looking for intelligent filmmakers to deal with this in an interesting manner. And of course there are difficult questions about the use of graphic violence in films. How much cruelty do you have to show? Is it really necessary? There are issues of the trust between filmmaker and protagonists. And sometimes for advocacy film, it's important that people say specific films. We see that often about films about the genocide in Darfur. So filmmakers go in there and they need a couple of, sound clips. One has to include rape, one has to include genocide, one has to include the Janjaweed, blah blah blah. So some filmmakers would go in there and just wait for the sound clip, and once they have it, it's like they turn the camera away and go away. Is that the kind of relationship and trust between filmmaker and protagonist that we are looking for? Might be good for advocacy, but it might be a bad film. So ironically, this might put advocacy films in contradiction to what I would consider good and ethical filmmaking. So I think this is one of the basic things that we have to discuss when we talk about using films in human rights education. So I think that our human rights film festivals, maybe we can debate that, are maybe not the best places for very direct advocacy, but they're great places for human rights education on a more general level, because I would argue that having strong advocacy films that focus on single issues and present them in a very closed manner might make you lose audiences, and it might attract only the people who are already interested in the stuff anyway. Or you might popularize human rights issues by presenting films that are very strong as cinematic products, so people can just go to one of our festivals because they love movies. They don't have to be interested in human rights, and ideally they're not. They just come because they know that we will present good films, and in the process will become engaged in this education process. So I guess that's everything I had to say for now.
Dziękuję bardzo, Andrea. Ponieważ powoli nasz czas się kończy, a chciałbym zostawić właśnie trochę czasu na pytania i na dyskusję, to może zróbmy w ten sposób, że udzielę jeszcze głosu Solveig Mulderheim z Rafto Foundation z Norwegii, która wiem, że ma pewne uwagi, którymi chciała się podzielić. I przejdziemy do pytań, które proszę kierować do nie tylko wszystkich panelistów, ale także obecnych tutaj na sali przedstawicieli innych festiwali filmów o prawach człowieka, równie znakomitych. Oksana Sarkisowa z festiwalu VIII z Budapesztu, który się właśnie niedawno skończył z wielkim sukcesem, Gediminas Natriukaitis z Wilna, Ad Hoc Inconvenient Film, znakomity festiwal, i równie świetny, wielki już w tej chwili festiwal Days Walk Gennady Kaufman z Kijowa. Solveig, proszę Cię bardzo, podziel się z nami swoimi refleksjami.
Thank you so much, Maciej. First, I want to congratulate all the film festivals for great film festivals. It is so nice to listen to all the work it has been to build up the festivals. I'm the head of education in the Rafto Foundation, basically I'm a teacher, and the only thing that I teach is human rights. And I'm a teacher that loves documentaries and also fiction movies. So I'm happy to hear that in Nuremberg fiction movies are also part of the program. And when I remember when I was young myself, I think I must have been 13 or 14 years old when I watched Cry Freedom for South Africa with Stephen Biko. Maybe there's somebody else here who saw that movie. And that certainly grabbed me and made me active in anti-racist work. Exactly the day after I saw it, actually. So it is a really strong medium. I mean, movies are. And of course, it is strong because you get so close, like Andrea said. I think the learning effect, you can compare it to reading a novel or take part in a role play, because you get to visit somebody in their lives. But a good movie, a good documentary is not necessarily a good documentary movie for educational purpose. So I would like to make some comments on what I think characterize a good movie or documentary for an educational purpose. I love when I see movies that I can link to science, that I can make visualize or illustrate points that I would like my students to think of. And of course, I think it is in a human rights education, it is always and of course important to have movies that does not stigmatize groups, because then it makes a step, maybe one step ahead, but then two back again. And it's always interesting to rock prejudices and to have movies that make us see ourselves from another angle. That's always interesting. And I think that movies for educational, both documentaries and fictional movies, should come with a package, and that means more precisely an education pack. But I had also one question, and it was really nice to hear about the One World system that you're making to make movies available after, because all these wonderful, wonderful movies suddenly disappear after a festival. And it's so nice to hear that systems are about to build, you're about to build up systems to make them available. But then I'm asking, how is it possible to make them available for an educational purpose? How is it possible to make documentaries? Fiction movies are easy, but they're not. I would like to know more about that as well. But how is it possible to make documentaries available for school classes after the film festival? How can we cooperate about making systems that works? Thank you.
Okay, so I can tell you how it started with One World in Schools. It started 10 years ago, and with really basic idea of bringing kids from elementary and high schools to the cinema. So during the festival in the morning, where usually there's like no screening for the adult audience because adults are at work. So, but the cinemas were rented, so we just decided that we would bring kids to cinemas with their teachers. And right from the beginning, it was important not only to show the films, but also have follow-up discussions afterwards. Because it's just important for, not only for the adults, but especially for the children to get their emotions or reactions that they got from the films right after the screenings, and also because they are in a different space than is the classroom, so it's very often really opened discussions that they would never have in a classroom, because they would feel, you know, because you're in the cinema, you're not in class, so it really works psychologically very well. So this is how it really started, bringing kids to the cinema. And now the program that we have is, but it is, it was in a cooperation with the Ministry of Education, of creating like packages of different topics that would include, as you said, the documentary film, but then the educational package, which would, like, an example of educational package is like question and answers that relate to the film and that the kids might ask. So the teacher who is using the film is prepared for answering the questions. Then there would be like games and interactive activities that the teacher can do with the children, and they could be like other things. I cannot think about anything now, but it was also important to start training the teachers of really using a different method of teaching that they were used to teach from the old days. So, and I think this is the hardest thing, because you can give to to classes and to schools like any kind of perfect package of any kind of best interactive material, but if the teachers are not able to use it, if they just put it on the shelf, then it's just waste of money, time and everything. So it really goes, you are creating the materials together with the teachers, but you are also training the teachers and you are bringing kids to the cinema. And they are like, yeah, so that's, and it costs money, so it's, I mean, it's important to get some kind of financial support either from the states or from like other sources. Yeah. And we were lucky at the time when the whole One World in School started that we had support of the Ministry of Culture that I was saying. But for example, nowadays the Ministry of Culture that we have is just a total asshole, and he goes really against everything that has been built nowadays. He doesn't believe in multiculturalism, he doesn't believe in interactive methods, he believes in teaching nationalism and conservative values to the children. There is forbidden any like sex education in schools, and it's like, you know, going back like 20 years ago, so...
I'm going to Poland.
Yeah, so... yeah.
Welcome to Poland.
Yeah, but it's a long process, and what really helps is to get involved active teachers from the beginning, because you really need to have also their opinion about what films might work with the children well, which is really kind of not working with the children. And we also now have like special focus groups. So for example, before we decide to include the film in the package, we also have a focus group of children where we test how they react on the film. And the topics really range from like basic films on human rights, like rights of children, rights of women, to really like the recent past, as I talked about.
Yeah, I would just like to add maybe two things, and not to disencourage anyone, but one of the biggest problems that is developing, and it's already taken up stride, and we have to face as film festivals, but that each one of you would have to face if you wanted to use film as advocacy tools, is that alternative means of distribution outside of national theatrical release become the main source of income for film world sales companies. That sounds very strange if I say it like this, if you're not experienced, but it means that for the world sales companies, many filmmakers sell their films to world sales companies, which then means that you would assume that everybody would want to have a film about human rights watched by as many people as possible. That is not true, because they have to make money, and they want to make money, so they will charge you. In case of Hanna, they're able to purchase the rights for non-commercial, non-exclusive. These are non-commercial, non-exclusive rights. If I ask about that in Germany, they will start at 5,000 euros per film. So I can afford that, so we can do that kind of thing. And if you want to use film to screen outside, a platform that One World or Movies That Matter, for that example, is offering, you would have to pay for each individual screening. And it might cost you dearly. I mean, we're talking about 300, 500 euros. Screening, and no school will afford that, and nobody will go through the trouble of researching the rights, etc., etc. Just one more word, fiction films are much more expensive, and unless they're available in national distribution, you can forget about it, because you'll never be able to afford them.
I talked also to rozmawiam także z naszymi przyjaciółmi z innych festiwali. I'm sorry, but I was speaking for yourself. I w tej chwili rzeczywiście co najmniej 3 duże polskie festiwale potwierdzają to, co mnie się wydaje od kilku lat. Dokument jest już z reguły droższy niż fikcja i z reguły, jeśli ma perspektywy rynkowe, co na ogół oznacza także pewną jakość produkcji, jest kupowany przez wielkie korporacje i o czym rozmawialiśmy w czasie obiadu, najbardziej chyba na ironię zakrawa fakt, że najdroższe i posiadane przez najbogatsze korporacje są najbardziej antykorporacyjne filmy. Także te, które pokazujemy na festiwalu. Zapraszam do zadawania pytań, bo pani profesor.
Thank you. Thank you all for very interesting comments, and I have actually 2 points to make. One is about access to films. And I'll make a suggestion and see if you will go for it. And the other one is a question and comment. But I do use, I'm a college professor, and I do use films in my classes. And because of the time constraint, I can also show short films, like 20 minutes, and maximum would be 50 minutes, and I can use only a certain number of them, because otherwise students will say she's not teaching, she's just giving us and but one thing is, like, I think in general there's more demand for shorter films, one thing. The second is that I could use longer films if I could manage to provide access to my students to view them before they come to class. And I do sometimes do that because I have the college purchase the film, but in an average class I have 30 students. Students can check out the copy for 3 hours and view that, and practically that's impossible. It's like each student would take, unless they establish groups of 5s and so on, it's very difficult. So I cannot really use that venue much. So I make it recommended rather than required viewing. Suggestion is this. I'm a member of Netflix. For my personal viewing, I can view certain films online. If we could have a kind of bank of human rights documentaries and fiction and so on, it can be per actually view payment online. It is and it's like it can be, but it has to be a small amount. For $2, $3, my students can view the film and online, and then next day come to class and we can discuss it. I don't know how this would work in terms of distribution, copyrights, and all of that, but if there is such a mechanism, that would really increase the access, not only just for classroom use, but again, even for family viewing or any other way. So that's a suggestion, that is making it digitally available for viewers. The comment I have is about the ethics of documentaries in particular. Currently I am co-editing a volume we call Uses and Misuses of Human Rights. And in different ways we're looking at how genuine human rights advocacy ends up, that's the misuse part. That is like they, in a way, become counterproductive. You may be advocating the rights of one group, but that may entail violation of another group, and so on. Not the overt abuse and subversion of human rights, like invading Iraq to liberate it or something like that, but the misuse, unintentional misuse. And interestingly, when we called for papers for this particular volume, we got a lot of submissions related to documentaries, most of them written by anthropologists. That is kind of pointing out how the framing and categorization, the characterization in documentaries turn out to be damaging to some populations and so. One example I'll say eventually to one of the papers that we chose to include works on some films that depict Haitian sugarcane workers in Dominican Republic. And in these films, in general, the author comments the conflict is presented as between Dominicans and Haitians. Haitians are presented as victims, and Dominican Republican government and employers and so as the villains. The argument is that this completely puts basically two colored populations, pitting them against each other without putting any kind of historical background of the colonial and neo-colonial policies and how they end up actually being in that situation that's like about land tenure and various things. So how do you kind of sensitize the filmmakers to these broader implications? Do you have some such mechanism? Is there some kind of, again, do you hold some panels and discuss these things? So that would be an interesting thing to hear about. Thank you.
The very easy answer is we're not selecting their films, so they're usually not present at our festivals, which might be a problem, but then again, it's kind of how we operate, right? It's like we try to kick out those films as quickly as possible. Just to give you a different example where it's not the historic background, but sometimes you have films that show victims of gross human rights violations that have overcome the status of victim, and they're trying everything they can. They're very strong people to not portray themselves as victims. And then you have films that will just have them tell their story, and they use like the solo cello or the sad piano, and they have the slow motion where people are usually walking away from the camera in this very melancholic and melodramatic way, where actually the films are turning people who refuse to be victims, are very strong, back into victims. It's entirely only in the filmmaking. It's not a lack of research. It's not the problem with the political position in the film. It's with the very act of filmmaking that these films, I would call them unethical. So that's what I wanted to point out. I think that's important. If you teach human rights with film, you also have to know about film, how films are being made. And actually we try to educate teachers in film studies, not just in human rights issues, but in film studies, to be able to put your finger on what's happening. Because you might sense that something is wrong in this film, but just to understand how films are working.
Czas się niestety kończy. Proszę bardzo, pan profesor Szatyński jeszcze.
Pytanie, because this is a question to you directly. Actually, a couple of questions. One question is, if we try to put something like human rights films, especially short film, commons, that would be available for free, of do what Zara just said, would there be an international NGO that would run it if it got money and more? You don't have to answer now, but would you be willing to think how much money would be needed for that? Then I would be willing to start doing, something in this direction, because I think that having some human rights, especially short film commons for educational purposes, probably would be wonderful. So this is, I'm a convert to human rights films. At the beginning I didn't understand it. Now I think, especially when I saw the debates around the Human Rights Film Festival in Warsaw, I was just fascinated with it. My next question is perhaps not to you. Is it conceivable to think about having the human rights things, or generally things that you do in one word, put into computer games as subjects? I'm serious about this, because how we get the ones that are now 12, 13, 14 years old? We definitely won't get them through books, through papers, normal education, some from movies, but the computer games. And the last thing is to you, Hanna. The question is the following. While you were talking, I sent an SMS to an Office of Human Rights Governance grant program in Budapest, because I thought about your pocket, and I asked if you get any grant from them. The answer was no grants with them, but they may be getting grants from other parts of OSF, Open Society Foundation. They are very successful in fundraising. That you know. Now, I don't want you to reveal any secrets here, because you might have said, but if you were to advise other organizations how to develop good fundraising strategy, so don't give out any names or whatever, that would be extremely useful benefit and outcome of this panel. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Jeszcze Anna Trzewska, proszę bardzo. Z tyłu.
Hello, I will be speaking in English. I'm mostly addressing the directors of other festivals. I would like to share with you my experience from Tunisia and from Libya. I think that the public there needs to learn a lot about human rights. And it's very difficult to make them read books, even read texts. Even films are difficult. When I show them a film of 1 hour about the revolution in Poland, they say, could I put it in 3 minutes and on Facebook? So I cannot. But I would like to appeal to all of you here who are directing film festivals to please reach out to people there. I can give you some contacts, because they need to have a little bit of guidance in creating film festivals. They are not very experienced, and there is no tradition of film, and there is no tradition of human rights, of course. Dictatorships don't have those things. But definitely, yes, please, if you can, reach out to them. Your experience would be very valuable, and in my opinion, to educate in human rights in North Africa and Middle East, the film is the best, because people don't have the span of attention to watch anything else than films, and subtitling films is very easy. We've done it with our films that were produced by the Helsińska Foundation for Human Rights, mostly narrated by Nowicki, and they were a big success. We have them now in 6 or 7 languages, and please, I will personally give you all the details. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to introduce to you my colleague who's here, and Movies That Matter runs a program from which we try to help new starting initiatives in the field, in this field. So we gladly will contact the contacts you have and tell them about the program and the possibilities we have.
Can I just say something about Tunisia and everything? I came directly to Warsaw from Amman in Jordan, which saw, or is still seeing, and today is the final day, the 2nd edition of its Human Rights Film Festival. They will have a human rights section in the very renowned Cairo International Film Festival starting next year. They're reaching out to Tunisia as we speak, so there is a huge movement of human rights film festivals in the Arab world. I talked to a colleague just 2 days ago of a Palestinian colleague who wants to establish a human rights film festival there. So the good news, I guess, is that it's really spreading, and there's so many people from the Arab world also focusing on this form of human rights education through films. And many of them do not focus on documentaries alone because people are not used to the format, but they include fiction films, funny films, so stuff that it's easier to digest, I guess. It's spreading to Tunisia, to Algeria, Morocco, Egypt. Well, Bahrain probably will not see a human rights film festival for the next couple of decades because they just killed everyone. But Jordan is an example. Palestine might follow. Lebanon, there are talks of establishing it in Lebanon. So there is a movement, and it's going strong, and it's getting stronger every minute.
Yes, absolutely. I would just suggest that maybe we can invite some people from the region to watch, because we've invited just for 1 day the Libyan colleagues, and they are now all excited and wired up. And the suggestion is to get them to watch 1 or 2 films, and definitely yes, especially the new democracies, the 4 countries. Thank you.
Can I answer for the online thing?
Yeah, but very shortly, because we're really running out of time.
Sorry for that. Answer.
This kind of distribution we still do like old style DVDs, but I think it's not gonna last longer than 1 year. So we are already preparing to really have the film available online. But from our experience, once you really want to buy the rights for a region that is more than just Czech Republic, then the price is just much higher. And I think it's still, I really cannot imagine, even just for example, Visegrad countries, it would be, I think it's really impossible, because with the technology, it's like everything, even if you put it as just streaming, no downloading, people can download it. So the filmmakers and distributors are really afraid of just putting anything online still. And our experience from the Czech Republic regarding to the Netflix and like paying for the films, the reason why we are distributing films for free is that in Czech Republic there are other platforms where you can watch films for money. But even if it's only $2, you got like 5 views a month, which is really not good. So it's better to pay more money when you buy the film than to have just 5 people watch the films, except, yeah, so, and it's really kind of like corrupted in a way that people just got used to watching films for free, but that's just the way it is, so I really cannot imagine of having this program for money. I think we would have like much less audience watching the films.
Yeah, I totally agree, and also we launched a cooperation with Agora Media Group, the publisher of Gazeta Wyborcza, the biggest daily, so 14 films of our festival are now available for the viewers in Poland with Polish IP addresses, but it is already quite costly, but possible, but it's geo-restricted only to Poland, so otherwise I don't think it would be possible. But in a national scale, it appeared easier than expected. Thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo. Zapraszam na krótką przerwę i spotkanie z profesorem Essex.